Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. Back when I was in my 20s, I had a close group of friends. Like a lot of people that age, we spent our weekends hanging out, going to parties, and sometimes ending the night at a strip club. It was just what our group enjoyed doing back then. One of our friends was Kevin. Kevin was one of the nicest people you could ever meet. He was not the typical ladies' man. He was a little overweight, kind of nerdy and quiet. But he had a great personality and was someone everyone genuinely liked being around. Things were also going incredibly well for him. He had just earned a full scholarship to MIT. From the outside, it looked like his future was wide open. Then, everything changed. One day, while I was at work, my friend Scott called me. He told me Kevin's dad had called because Kevin was missing. His wallet and his car were still at the house, but Kevin was gone. So was one of the family's guns. The moment I heard that, I knew something was very wrong. I told Scott I was leaving work immediately and would be there in about 20 minutes. I had barely made it to my car when my phone rang again. It was Scott. His voice sounded completely different. He told me not to come in a hurry anymore. Kevin's dad had found him. He was outside, against a tree. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. I remember feeling completely numb. Nothing prepares you for hearing news like that. I still drove over because I needed to be there with everyone else. A few days later, we gathered for the visitation. It was an open casket service. The funeral home had done everything they could to restore his appearance, but you could still tell where they had reconstructed the side of his face that had been injured. Seeing him like that made everything feel painfully real. The next day was the funeral. After it was over, our group of friends decided to do something we all believed Kevin would have appreciated. We went to a strip club. It was not because we were trying to forget him. It was because we wanted to celebrate the kind of person he was and remember the good times we had all shared together. It felt like something that would have made him smile. The next morning, something happened that none of us has ever been able to explain. One of my friend's cars was covered in morning dew. Written across the window were the words, "Thank you." Sitting on the hood was an empty can of Pabst Blue Ribbon. That was Kevin's favorite beer. To this day, I have no idea how it happened. Maybe someone in our group did it as a quiet tribute, without ever admitting it. Maybe there is another perfectly ordinary explanation. Or maybe it was simply one of those moments that people carry with them because it brought comfort during an unimaginably painful time. Whatever the truth is, it has stayed with me for more than 30 years. What stays with me even more is wondering if things could have been different. Kevin had so much going for him. He was smart. He had friends who cared about him. He had an incredible future ahead of him. But none of us knew how much he was struggling inside. Back then, in the 1990s, people did not talk openly about depression or suicidal thoughts the way they do today. Many people believed they had to deal with those feelings alone. Looking back, I wish Kevin had felt like he could have talked to one of us. I wish he had known that none of us would have judged him. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe not. That is something I will never know. But if there is one lesson I have taken from losing my friend, it is this: keep an eye on the people you care about. Sometimes the person who seems to have everything going for them is fighting a battle that no one else can see. A simple conversation, a phone call, or asking someone if they are really okay might mean more than you will ever know. My dad comes from a family of farmers and builders. He grew up on a third-generation farm in Idaho with 6 brothers and sisters. Like many families with that background, hard work was just part of their lives. All of the boys originally went into construction trades, although one of his brothers eventually specialized in electrical engineering. That same brother spent years building a life for himself and his wife, who had been a police officer and later became a head detective. After they found out they could not have children of their own, they decided to put everything they had into creating the home and family they had always dreamed of. He built their dream house himself. It was not just a building. It represented years of work, sacrifice, and hope. They poured their money, time, and energy into making it the perfect place where they could eventually raise a family. A couple of years later, they got the opportunity they had been waiting for. They were able to adopt a young Native American boy from one of the local tribes in their area. They welcomed him into their home and gave him the life they had always wanted to provide for a child. A few years after that, they adopted another child, a young black girl. Finally, they had the family they had always dreamed of. Their house, which had once only been a dream, was now filled with children, laughter, and memories. For years, everything seemed exactly the way it was supposed to be. Then, their son turned 16. He was an active kid and had already experienced a few injuries from things like snowmobiling and sports. Around that time, he had recently undergone knee surgery and was recovering while attending physical therapy. The Monday after his surgery, he stayed home from school. He told his parents that he was still in a lot of pain and did not feel well. He said he just wanted to rest and sleep. Honestly, there was nothing unusual about that. He was only 72 hours out from surgery. He was dealing with pain, adjusting to limited mobility, trying to recover during football season, and getting used to new medications. To everyone around him, it seemed like a normal teenager having a difficult recovery day. A few hours passed. Later that day, his father came home because he was supposed to meet his wife for an appointment they had planned together. As he walked through the house, he called out for his son. There was no answer. He checked the places where his son usually spent his time: the large living room, his bedroom, the spots where he would normally relax. But he was nowhere to be found. His father started calling his name louder as he moved through the house, becoming more concerned with every passing second. Then he heard something. A loud bang came from the garage. At first he thought maybe something had fallen from a shelf. Maybe something had come loose on the trailer. It sounded like an ordinary accident, something that could happen in a garage. He walked in to see what had caused the noise. But what he found was something no parent should ever have to experience. His son was lying there in a pool of his own blood, holding his mother's service weapon. There was no note, no explanation, no warning, nothing that could answer the question of why. The only explanation anyone could come up with was that something had gone terribly wrong with his medications. The combination of prescriptions he was taking after surgery may have affected him in a way nobody expected. The pain, the medication, and his altered state of mind may have led him to believe that ending his life was the only way to escape what he was feeling in that moment. What makes it even harder to understand is that this was not the person everyone knew. He was a happy kid. He loved life. He was the kind of person who made people smile. Even while recovering from surgery, he was still the same carefree person his family loved. There were no signs that anyone saw. No one had any idea that he was struggling with something so serious. My uncle and his wife still live in that same house today. He still drives home from work and parks in that same garage every single day. It has been 15 years. 15 years of walking through the same rooms, seeing the same walls, and living in the place where their lives changed forever. I still miss him every day. The hardest part is knowing how much life he had ahead of him. He should still be here. He should be growing older with the rest of us, making memories, and experiencing all the things he never got the chance to see. In a couple of weeks, I am getting married, and one of the hardest things for me is knowing he will not be there. He was supposed to be my best man. I still wish he was here. I still wish we could have shared those moments together. I still wish that somehow, someone could have known what was happening inside his mind that day and helped him through it. But all we can do now is remember him. He was loved. He mattered. And even though he has been gone for 15 years, he is still a part of our family and always will be. About 10 years ago, I was in my early 20s studying abroad in London. One weekend, I randomly decided to book a solo trip to Venice. I did not really tell anyone in my study abroad program that I was going. I just made the plans and went on my own. The trip itself was amazing. Venice was everything I had imagined. The streets, the canals, the old buildings, and the atmosphere all felt like something out of a movie. But even after all these years, there is one moment from that trip that I still think about. On the second day of my weekend visit, I was walking around Venice with no real plan. I was just exploring the streets and enjoying the city. I did not have phone service there, so I could not use GPS or check where I was. At first, that made the experience feel more adventurous. I was just wandering and discovering places naturally. Then it started raining. I decided it was probably time to head back to my accommodation, but I quickly realized I was more lost than I thought. I was trying to figure out which direction to go when suddenly an older man appeared and offered to hold his umbrella over me. He was friendly and polite at first. We started having a small conversation, and when I told him I was American, he seemed interested. He told me he wanted to show me the real Venice and offered to take me to a cafe. My first reaction was that I did not really want to go. I was traveling alone, I did not know this man, and something about accepting an invitation from a stranger did not feel completely right. But I also did not want to be rude, so I agreed. We started walking. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. We passed by several cafes and busy streets. I thought maybe he really was just trying to be kind and show a visitor around his city. But after about 20 minutes, I started noticing that we were moving farther and farther away from the crowded tourist areas. The streets became quieter, and there were fewer people around. A feeling of uneasiness started building inside me. I asked him how much farther the cafe was. He casually told me it was not much longer, and said he wanted to give me a real Italian experience instead of taking me somewhere filled with tourists. That answer did not make me feel better. A few moments later, we reached a small plaza with a few shops around it. Off to one side was a narrow alleyway that led away from the open area. The alley immediately caught my attention because it looked completely different from the streets we had been walking through. It was dark and empty. There were no people walking around, no signs, no restaurants, and no indication that there was a cafe anywhere nearby. The only things I could see were large, heavy, wooden doors that looked like they belonged to private apartments or old buildings. There was nothing there that suggested we were about to enter a charming local cafe. We stopped at the entrance of the alley. Then he looked at me and said, "Okay, this is the way." He had a strange smile on his face and motioned for me to walk ahead of him. That was the exact moment something inside me changed. I froze. I cannot fully explain it, but every instinct I had was telling me not to go down that alley. Something felt wrong. The situation suddenly felt dangerous in a way I could not logically explain. My mind started racing. I was alone in a foreign country. I had no phone service. Nobody from my program knew exactly where I was. I was standing next to a stranger who had slowly guided me away from the busy parts of the city and was now trying to lead me into a dark, empty alley. I knew I needed to leave. I quickly came up with an excuse and told him I was sorry, but I had not realized how late it had gotten. I said I was supposed to meet a friend who was flying in and that I needed to get back to my hotel. Of course, none of that was true. He immediately looked disappointed. He tried to convince me to keep going and insisted that we were almost there. But I stayed firm. I smiled, said goodbye, and started walking in another direction. I hurried toward a show or attraction we had passed earlier because I wanted to get back around other people. I figured if I could reach a crowded area, he would eventually leave me alone. But he followed me. He kept walking behind me and continued trying to talk to me. He would not take the hint and would not leave. I do not remember exactly how I finally managed to lose him, but eventually I did. I got away from him and made my way back toward busier streets where I felt safer. Looking back, I still wonder what his intentions actually were. Maybe he really was just a kind local who wanted to show a foreign visitor a more authentic side of Venice. Maybe he was completely harmless, and my fear was based only on being alone in an unfamiliar place. But that feeling I had when we reached the entrance of that alley has never left me. Something about that moment felt wrong. I have always trusted that instinct because it was so strong. It was like every part of me was screaming not to take another step. I will never know what would have happened if I had followed him down that alley. Maybe nothing would have happened at all. Maybe I would have ended up drinking coffee in a quiet little cafe and laughing about how suspicious I had been. But there is also another possibility. Maybe I would have walked into a situation I could not easily escape from. The thought that I could have disappeared into some unknown corner of Venice still scares me. I sometimes imagine myself being taken away in a boat, hidden from sight, with nobody knowing where I was, because I had not told anyone about my trip. I will never know the truth about that man or what he wanted. But that experience taught me something I have never forgotten. Sometimes your instincts notice things before your mind can explain them. That feeling I had at the entrance of that dark alley may have been nothing more than fear. Or maybe it was the thing that kept me safe. Either way, it is a moment from my life that I still remember clearly, even after a decade. I went to Venice expecting a beautiful adventure, and while I did find that, I also walked away with a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen when something inside you says, "Do not go any further." The neighborhood where I used to live always seemed quiet from the outside. It was one of those places where families walked their dogs in the evenings, children played outside after school, and most people knew at least a few of their neighbors by name. It wasn't perfect, but it felt safe. If someone had asked me back then whether I thought anything truly horrific could happen there, I probably would have laughed and said no. Looking back now, I realize that appearances can be incredibly misleading. 2 events happened while I lived there that have stayed with me ever since. Neither happened directly to me, but both were close enough that they forever changed the way I look at ordinary apartment buildings and the lives hidden behind closed doors. The first tragedy happened in my own apartment building. Like most apartment complexes, the walls weren't exactly soundproof. Every now and then you'd hear someone's television, a dog barking, kids running down the hallway, or the occasional argument between neighbors. Usually it was nothing more than everyday life. One family in particular seemed completely ordinary. A husband, a wife, a young son who couldn't have been older than 3 or 4 years old. The father was a police officer, something most of the residents knew. Whenever people talked about him, it was usually in passing. He seemed polite enough whenever anyone crossed paths with him. If there were problems inside their home, nobody outside really knew about them. Then one night, everything changed. It was sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning when the couple began arguing. From what neighbors later described, it wasn't a normal disagreement. People could hear shouting echoing through the building, raised voices, doors slamming. The kind of fight that makes you pause for a moment and wonder whether someone should call the police, only to remind yourself that arguments happen and hopefully things will calm down. At some point during the argument, the husband stormed out of the apartment. He wasn't alone. He took their young son with him. No one knew exactly what was going through his mind at the time, but later investigators pieced together what had happened. He drove the little boy to his brother's house. Imagine answering your door in the middle of the night to find your brother standing there with his preschool-aged son. Naturally, the brother was confused. He wanted to know what was going on. The father reportedly explained that he and his wife had been fighting and asked if the child could stay there for the night. The uncle, believing it was simply a heated argument between a married couple, agreed without much hesitation. He probably assumed everyone would cool off, get some sleep, and sort things out in the morning. After all, plenty of couples have terrible arguments without things ending in tragedy. He had no reason to imagine what would happen next. After leaving his son somewhere safe, the man got back into his car. Instead of driving somewhere else to calm down, he returned to the apartment. The argument resumed. More shouting, more fighting. Then everything became horribly quiet. Sometime afterward, he shot his wife. Then he turned the gun on himself. By the time emergency responders arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. Both of them were dead. I didn't hear any of it that night. To this day, I consider myself incredibly fortunate for that. I slept through the entire tragedy, completely unaware of what had unfolded only a short distance away. Some of the closest neighbors weren't so lucky. They heard everything. The yelling, the final gunshots, the chaos afterward. Some even had to speak with investigators because they'd heard parts of the argument before the shooting. I've often wondered what it must have been like for them. How do you go back to sleeping peacefully in your own apartment after hearing something like that through the walls? How do you ever hear raised voices again without remembering that night? The part that has always haunted me most, though, isn't the violence itself. It's the little boy. Without realizing it, his father had taken him away from the apartment shortly before everything happened. That one decision almost certainly saved him from witnessing something no child should ever see. Instead, he spent the night safely with his uncle, completely unaware that his entire life had changed forever. By morning, both of his parents were gone. I've thought about him many times over the years. He was so young that he may not even remember that night clearly. Or maybe he remembers fragments. A late-night car ride, his uncle opening the door, adults speaking in worried voices, then waking up the next morning to news that no child should ever have to hear. I sincerely hope he eventually found peace. The second event happened only about a block away at a friend's apartment building. Although it wasn't the same building, it looked remarkably similar. Several stories tall, families living on every floor, balconies overlooking a shared courtyard. The ground level featured beautiful white tile flooring that stretched across the main entrance and common area. Everyone who lived there walked across those tiles every single day. Children played there. Neighbors stopped to chat. People carried groceries through that entrance without giving the floor beneath them a second thought. Then one night, something happened that changed how many residents looked at that space forever. A woman who lived in the building had apparently been struggling with severe depression for quite some time. Most people had no idea how much she was suffering. Like so many mental health struggles, much of it remained hidden from those around her. One night, overwhelmed by whatever pain she was carrying, she climbed to the top of the building. Then, she jumped. The entire neighborhood was talking about it the next day. Local news covered the story. People whispered about it in grocery stores and apartment hallways. For a while, it seemed like everyone had heard what happened. I wasn't there that night, but one of my closest friends lived in that building. She was. When she eventually told me about it, something about the way she spoke has stayed with me far longer than the news reports ever did. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't trying to shock anyone. In fact, she barely spoke above a whisper. She simply stared off into space for a moment before saying something I'll probably never forget. Red, she paused. There was red everywhere. She didn't need to explain what she meant. The image formed instantly in my mind. The bright white tiles that had always looked so clean were suddenly covered in blood. The contrast must have been overwhelming. Emergency services eventually arrived. The area was cleaned. Life slowly returned to normal, at least on the surface. Weeks later, I visited my friend at her apartment. As we walked through the entrance together, she quietly pointed toward the floor. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then, I looked closer. Some of the white tiles weren't completely white anymore. Scattered across the floor were faint, irregular dark stains. Not bright, not obvious. Just subtle patches where the color never seemed quite right again. She looked at me. Then she said quietly, "Yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking." They cleaned everything as well as they could, but some stains never came off. I remember staring at those tiles for a long time. If nobody had told me what happened there, I probably would have walked right over them without ever noticing. But once I knew, I couldn't stop looking. The stains weren't large. They weren't graphic. Yet somehow they were more disturbing because they remained. A permanent reminder hidden in plain sight. Hundreds of people probably walked across them every day without knowing why they were there. Children ran over them. Visitors rolled suitcases across them. Neighbors stopped there to chat after work. Most never realized they were standing where someone's life had ended. My friend admitted she still thought about that night every time she walked through the entrance. Even years later, she couldn't completely separate the place from the memory. Sometimes she'd catch herself looking at those same tiles without meaning to. Not because she wanted to. Because once you've associated a place with something tragic, it's almost impossible to see it the same way again. What has always struck me about both of these events is how ordinary everything seemed beforehand. In the first building, there was simply a family living behind an apartment door. To everyone else, they looked like any other family. No one passing them in the hallway could have guessed that one argument would end in unimaginable violence. In the second building, there was simply another resident quietly carrying burdens nobody else fully understood. People probably smiled politely when they passed her in the hallway. Maybe they exchanged small talk in the elevator. Maybe they assumed she was doing fine, because that's what most people assume. Then, in a single night, everything changed. Both tragedies happened in places people considered home. Places where children laughed, where neighbors borrowed sugar, where birthdays were celebrated, where ordinary life continued every day. It's strange how apartment buildings work. Dozens or even hundreds of lives exist side by side, People share walls, ceilings, floors, and hallways, yet they often know almost nothing about what the people next door are experiencing. Someone might be celebrating the happiest day of their life while another family, just one wall away, is experiencing their worst. Most of us never know. That's something these events taught me. You never really know what someone else is carrying, or what might be happening behind a closed door. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about those buildings whenever I visit apartment complexes. I wonder how many stories exist inside them that nobody else knows. How many people are quietly struggling? How many families are holding themselves together? How many ordinary-looking evenings are actually someone's breaking point? Neither of these memories involves anything supernatural. No ghosts, no mysterious figures, no unexplained events, just real life. And sometimes, I think that's even more unsettling, because unlike ghost stories, these things actually happened. One family lost 2 parents in a single night because an argument turned into irreversible violence. Another building was left with physical reminders of a woman whose pain became too much to bear. The buildings themselves still stand. People still live in them. New families have probably moved in over the years. Children have likely played in those same hallways without ever knowing what happened there long before they arrived. Life always moves forward. It has to. But every now and then, I remember those stories and realize that some places quietly carry memories that never completely disappear. Sometimes the walls remember. Sometimes the floors remember. And sometimes, even after every visible sign has been cleaned away, a few faint stains remain, reminding those who know the story that not every mark can be washed away. My friend once told me a story that has stayed with me ever since. I wasn't there to experience it myself, but I've heard him tell it more than once over the years, and every time he does, the details are exactly the same. He never tries to make it sound more dramatic than it was. In fact, he usually shrugs it off before admitting that it's still one of the few things in his life that he has never been able to explain. It happened when he was still fairly young. His grandmother lived alone in an old house that had been in the family for many years. It wasn't the kind of place that looked haunted in an obvious way. There were no broken windows, no abandoned rooms covered in cobwebs, and no creepy stories that everyone in town whispered about. It was simply an old house that had seen generations come and go. Still, according to my friend, there was always something unsettling about it. The floors creaked even when nobody was walking. The long hallway seemed darker than the rest of the house, even during the day. At night, every sound seemed louder, and the silence between those sounds felt almost heavy. His mother needed to spend a night there to help his grandmother with a few things around the house. She didn't really want to stay by herself, so she asked him if he would come along. Like most kids, he wasn't thrilled about spending the night in an old house instead of being home. But he agreed because he didn't want his mom to have to go alone. They arrived in the afternoon. Everything seemed completely normal. His grandmother was happy to see them. They spent the evening talking, ate dinner together, watched a little television, and cleaned up around the house. Nothing unusual happened while the sun was still up. In daylight, the place honestly looked like any other older family home. The strange feeling didn't really start until later. As evening settled in, the house became noticeably quieter. Outside, there weren't many neighbors nearby, so once it got dark there wasn't much to hear besides the occasional breeze moving through the trees. Inside, every little sound suddenly stood out. The ticking of an old clock, the refrigerator humming, the wooden floors settling. the soft groan of old pipes somewhere in the walls. His grandmother eventually went to bed, and his mother took one of the spare bedrooms. Since there weren't enough bedrooms for everyone, my friend made himself comfortable on the living room couch. He actually liked sleeping on couches when he was a kid. It felt like a little adventure, so he wasn't bothered by it. He stretched out under a blanket, watched television until he got sleepy, then turned everything off. Soon the house was completely dark. At some point during the night, he woke up. He wasn't sure what time it was. The room was almost pitch black except for a faint glow coming through the curtains from outside. He lay there quietly for a moment, still half asleep, trying to figure out what had woken him. Then, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, steady, coming from somewhere down the hallway. He immediately assumed it was his mother. Maybe she had gotten up to use the bathroom. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she was just checking on him before going back to bed. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation. He didn't think anything of it. In fact, he did what a lot of kids do when they hear one of their parents nearby in the middle of the night. He quickly closed his eyes and pretended to be asleep. He figured if his mom looked into the living room and saw him awake, she'd probably tell him to go back to sleep. So he stayed perfectly still. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, getting closer. He could hear them moving down the hallway toward the living room. Each step sounded deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, just calm, steady footsteps moving in his direction. Eventually, they entered the living room. He could hear them approaching the couch. His heart started beating a little faster, but he still wasn't frightened. He was simply waiting for his mother to glance over, see that he was asleep, and quietly walk away. Instead, the footsteps stopped, right beside the couch. He stayed completely still. He could sense someone standing over him. Even with his eyes closed, he was certain someone was there. Seconds passed. Maybe longer. Then something happened that he says he can still remember with absolute clarity. He felt warm breath across his forehead. Not a breeze, not air from a vent. The unmistakable feeling of someone leaning over him closely enough that their breathing touched his skin. He remembers thinking his mother must be about to kiss him goodnight, the way parents sometimes do without wanting to wake their children. He waited. But the kiss never came. Instead, after lingering there for what felt like several long seconds, whoever was standing over him slowly straightened back up. The footsteps began again. They moved away from the couch, crossed the room, returned toward the hallway, then gradually faded into silence. He stayed exactly where he was, eyes tightly shut. He didn't dare move. At some point, exhaustion finally won, and he eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, making the events of the night seem almost silly. The house looked perfectly ordinary again. They all had breakfast together. His grandmother was making coffee, his mother was helping clean the kitchen, and everything felt completely normal. While they were eating, he casually mentioned what had happened. He asked his mother why she had come to check on him during the night. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" He explained that he'd heard her walking down the hallway, stopping beside the couch, and leaning over him. His mother immediately shook her head. She told him she'd never left her bedroom. According to her, she'd gone into the room, shut the door, and stayed there all night. When he looked skeptical, she explained why. She admitted she'd felt incredibly uneasy after going to bed. She couldn't explain it. Nothing specific had happened. She simply had a strong feeling that something wasn't right in the house. It wasn't panic exactly, more like an overwhelming sense that she shouldn't leave the bedroom. She said she'd stayed there the entire night, because she couldn't shake the feeling that wandering around the house in the dark was a bad idea. She hadn't gone to the bathroom. She hadn't checked on him. She hadn't walked down the hallway even once. My friend said that's when he stopped smiling. He realized the footsteps he had heard couldn't have been his mother. His grandmother had also stayed in her room. There hadn't been anyone else in the house. For years afterward, one question kept bothering him. What would he have seen if he'd opened his eyes? He says he came close several times. Part of him desperately wanted to look. But another part told him not to. Whether it was fear, instinct, or simply childhood imagination, he doesn't know. He kept his eyes shut. To this day, he says he's strangely grateful he never looked. Sometimes not knowing is easier than finding out. A few months later, his grandmother passed away. Naturally, the family had to return to the house to sort through her belongings and prepare it to be sold. This time, the visit felt different. There was sadness mixed with nostalgia as they walked through each room, deciding what to keep and what to donate. During the daytime, everything felt completely ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Birds could be heard outside. The old place seemed peaceful. If someone had shown up during the afternoon, they probably would have wondered why anyone had ever described it as unsettling. It just looked like an aging family home full of memories. But as the day wore on, something changed. The sun slowly dipped lower. The bright rooms grew dim. Long shadows stretched across the floors. The familiar silence returned. My friend said it was almost impossible to explain. Nothing actually happened. No voices, no footsteps, no objects moving. Yet both he and his mother independently started feeling increasingly uncomfortable. It wasn't fear caused by remembering the earlier experience. According to them, the atmosphere itself seemed different after dark. The house suddenly felt colder. The quiet became almost oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards made them glance toward empty hallways. Every shadow looked deeper than it should have. Neither of them wanted to admit they were uncomfortable at first. Eventually, his mother was the one who finally spoke. She simply said she didn't think they should spend the night there. He immediately agreed. There wasn't even a discussion. Neither of them wanted to sleep in that house again. Instead of staying another night, they packed up what they could, locked the house, drove into town, and checked into a small motel. Only after they were safely there did they both admit how relieved they felt to have left. Over the years, my friend has considered every logical explanation he can think of. Maybe he imagined the footsteps. Maybe he was half asleep and dreaming. Maybe an old house naturally makes strange noises at night. Those are all reasonable possibilities, but no explanation has ever accounted for the sensation of someone breathing directly onto his forehead. Or why his mother independently admitted she had been too unsettled to leave her room that same night. He doesn't claim it was a ghost. He doesn't insist anything supernatural happened. He simply says something occurred that he has never been able to explain. Whenever people ask him whether he believes in ghosts, he usually laughs and says he honestly doesn't know. What he does know is that he spent one night in an old house, heard footsteps approach his couch, felt someone lean over him close enough to feel their breath, and later discovered that the person he assumed it was had never left her room. Sometimes I wonder the same thing he does. If I had been lying there, would I have opened my eyes? I'd like to think curiosity would have gotten the better of me. But if I heard slow footsteps approaching in the darkness, felt someone standing over me, and sensed warm breath on my forehead while believing I was completely alone, I'm not sure I'd have had the courage. Maybe keeping his eyes closed was the smartest decision he ever made. Or Maybe he missed the only chance he would ever have to discover what had really been standing beside that couch. Either way, decades later, it's still a story that gives me chills whenever I think about it. Even without a clear explanation, it's unsettling because it lives in that uncomfortable space between imagination and reality. Nothing dramatic was ever seen. Nothing was ever proven, yet the memory has stayed with him his entire life. And every time he tells it, he ends with the same quiet sentence. I still wonder what was looking down at me that night. I'd be happy to rewrite it while keeping the story close to the original, improving the flow, using simple English, and avoiding headings or bold text. I've also softened some of the graphic descriptions while preserving the emotional impact, making it more suitable for a broad US, UK, and Canadian audience. One of the most disturbing memories from my childhood happened in the early 2000s. And even though some parts have become blurry over the years, there are certain images I'll never be able to forget. At the time, my family lived in a small ancestral compound where several relatives shared the property along with a few tenants who rented rooms. Everyone knew one another, and despite living so close together, it was a warm, friendly place. It felt like one big extended family. Most evenings followed the same routine. The adults would gather in the living room to watch Filipino soap operas while talking about work, family, and neighborhood gossip. My cousins and I would sit off to one side playing cards, laughing, and trying to stay awake long after we were supposed to be in bed. It was a simple life, but looking back, those evenings are some of my happiest childhood memories. Among the tenants was a young woman I'll call Mary. She was a student and kept mostly to herself. She wasn't rude or unfriendly, just very quiet. Every now and then she'd smile or politely greet people, but she rarely joined conversations with everyone else. My mother always had a soft spot for people who seemed lonely. Whenever she saw Mary outside her room, she'd ask how school was going, whether she'd eaten, or if everything was okay. She treated her almost like another daughter. For a while, Mary would answer politely. Then, something changed. A few weeks before everything happened, she became noticeably different. She hardly ever came out of her room anymore. When she did, she looked exhausted and distant, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. She avoided eye contact and barely spoke. Even as a child, I could tell something wasn't right. My mother noticed it too. She tried checking in on Mary several times, gently asking if something was bothering her or if she needed help. Mary would always insist she was fine. She never opened up about whatever she was going through. None of us knew the truth. Life continued as usual until one night that changed everything. I still remember that evening surprisingly well. Some of my uncles were outside preparing pigs for a family event the next day, so several of us kids stayed up far later than we should have, watching them work. It was exciting because we rarely got to stay awake that late. At some point, my mom came into our room and scolded all of us for still being awake. She told us it was already around 2 in the morning and that we needed to go to bed. We were just about to settle down when a scream shattered the silence. It wasn't the kind of scream you mistake for someone joking around. It was pure panic. Everyone immediately rushed outside. I followed before my mother could stop me. That's when I saw something no child should ever have to see. A newborn baby had been left in the backyard. Even now, decades later, I can still remember the shock that spread through everyone who was there. Adults began shouting. Some people froze. Others immediately tried to help while someone called for emergency services. My mother quickly grabbed us and tried to pull us back inside the house. She didn't want any of us to witness what had happened. But before I looked away, I caught a glimpse that has stayed with me ever since. It's a memory I wish I could erase. The police would later determine that the baby had not survived. The details surrounding what had happened were heartbreaking. Not long afterward, people noticed a trail leading toward Mary's room. That's when the terrible truth began to unfold. Mary had secretly been pregnant. No one living in the compound had realized. From what everyone later understood, she had been terrified that her parents would discover the pregnancy. She had apparently been carrying an overwhelming amount of fear, shame, and emotional pain completely on her own. Whether she was suffering from severe depression, panic, or another mental health crisis, no one can truly know what was happening inside her mind that night. The young woman my mother had been trying to help for weeks had reached a point where she desperately needed support, but never felt able to ask for it. The following morning, the entire compound was filled with police officers, paramedics, and investigators. Mary's parents arrived shortly afterward. I still remember the heartbreaking sound of their crying. As a child, I didn't fully understand everything that was happening around me. Adults spoke quietly, trying to keep us away from the investigation. From what I remember hearing later, Mary was taken to a psychiatric facility to receive treatment. Some details have faded with time, but I still remember the overwhelming sadness that settled over everyone in the compound. No one was angry. No one celebrated justice. Everyone simply seemed devastated. It felt as though several lives had been destroyed in a single night. As horrifying as that event was, what happened afterward became another story entirely. A few days later, I overheard some of the adults whispering among themselves. They believed my mother was being haunted by the baby's spirit. Our house was very old. It had large built-in wooden cabinets that had probably been there for generations. According to my mother, strange things began happening after the tragedy. She sometimes thought she heard the faint sound of a baby crying somewhere inside the house. At first, she'd search every room, convinced she must be imagining it. But she could never find where the sound was coming from. Other times, she said she heard tiny footsteps moving through the hallway late at night. Occasionally, there were strange knocking or crackling noises coming from the old wooden wardrobe. Whether those sounds came from the old house settling or something else, none of us could say. The experience deeply unsettled her. The thing that frightened her most wasn't the noises. It was what she claimed to see. She occasionally described brief visions of a small child wrapped inside a clear plastic bag in the hallway before the image would disappear almost instantly. She never described these experiences dramatically. If anything, she seemed frightened by them herself. None of the rest of us ever saw what she claimed to see. That's what made it even stranger. Whatever she was experiencing seemed to affect only her. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was guilt, because she'd tried so hard to help Mary and couldn't save either of them. Or maybe it was something none of us can explain. To this day, I honestly don't know. Only my mother ever reported those experiences. The rest of us heard the story secondhand. A few months later, our family moved away from the compound. Life slowly continued. The property eventually became just another place from my childhood. But whenever I think back on those years, that night always comes back first. It's a story filled with tragedy, unanswered questions, and memories that have never completely faded. More than anything, I think about Mary. I think about how different things might have been if she'd felt safe enough to ask for help before everything reached that point. And I think about the lasting impact that one terrible night had on everyone who lived in that old house. Whether my mother's experiences afterward were the result of grief, trauma, or something far more mysterious, I'll probably never know. I only know that some memories never truly leave you. No matter how many years pass, certain nights remain with you forever. One of the most disturbing memories from my childhood happened in the early 2000s, and even though some parts have become blurry over the years, there are certain images I'll never be able to forget. At the time, my family lived in a small ancestral compound where several relatives shared the property along with a few tenants who rented rooms. Everyone knew one another, and despite living so close together, it was a warm, friendly place. It felt like one big extended family. Most evenings followed the same routine. The adults would gather in the living room to watch Filipino soap operas while talking about work, family, and neighborhood gossip. My cousins and I would sit off to one side playing cards, laughing, and trying to stay awake long after we were supposed to be in bed. It was a simple life, but looking back, those evenings are some of my happiest childhood memories. Among the tenants was a young woman I'll call Mary. She was a student and kept mostly to herself. She wasn't rude or unfriendly, just very quiet. Every now and then she'd smile or politely greet people, but she rarely joined conversations with everyone else. My mother always had a soft spot for people who seemed lonely. Whenever she saw Mary outside her room, she'd ask how school was going, whether she'd eaten, or if everything was okay. She treated her almost like another daughter. For a while, Mary would answer politely. Then, something changed. A few weeks before everything happened, she became noticeably different. She hardly ever came out of her room anymore. When she did, she looked exhausted and distant, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. She avoided eye contact and barely spoke. Even as a child, I could tell something wasn't right. My mother noticed it too. She tried checking in on Mary several times, gently asking if something was bothering her or if she needed help. Mary would always insist she was fine. She never opened up about whatever she was going through. None of us knew the truth. Life continued as usual until one night that changed everything. I still remember that evening surprisingly well. Some of my uncles were outside preparing pigs for a family event the next day, so several of us kids stayed up far later than we should have, watching them work. It was exciting because we rarely got to stay awake that late. At some point, my mom came into our room and scolded all of us for still being awake. She told us it was already around 2 in the morning and that we needed to go to bed. We were just about to settle down when a scream shattered the silence. It wasn't the kind of scream you mistake for someone joking around. It was pure panic. Everyone immediately rushed outside. I followed before my mother could stop me. That's when I saw something no child should ever have to see. A newborn baby had been left in the backyard. Even now, decades later, I can still remember the shock that spread through everyone who was there. Adults began shouting. Some people froze. Others immediately tried to help while someone called for emergency services. My mother quickly grabbed us and tried to pull us back inside the house. She didn't want any of us to witness what had happened, but before I looked away, I caught a glimpse that has stayed with me ever since. It's a memory I wish I could erase. The police would later determine that the baby had not survived. The details surrounding what had happened were heartbreaking. Not long afterward, people noticed a trail leading toward Mary's room. That's when the terrible truth began to unfold. Mary had secretly been pregnant. No one living in the compound had realized. From what everyone later understood, she had been terrified that her parents would discover the pregnancy. She had apparently been carrying an overwhelming amount of fear, shame, and emotional pain completely on her own. Whether she was suffering from severe depression, panic, or another mental health crisis. No one can truly know what was happening inside her mind that night. The young woman my mother had been trying to help for weeks had reached a point where she desperately needed support, but never felt able to ask for it. The following morning, the entire compound was filled with police officers, paramedics, and investigators. Mary's parents arrived shortly afterward. I still remember the heartbreaking sound of their crying. As a child, I didn't fully understand everything that was happening around me. Adults spoke quietly, trying to keep us away from the investigation. From what I remember hearing later, Mary was taken to a psychiatric facility to receive treatment. Some details have faded with time, but I still remember the overwhelming sadness that settled over everyone in the compound. No one was angry. No one celebrated justice. Everyone simply seemed devastated. It felt as though several lives had been destroyed in a single night. As horrifying as that event was, what happened afterward became another story entirely. A few days later, I overheard some of the adults whispering among themselves. They believed my mother was being haunted by the baby's spirit. Our house was very old. It had large built-in wooden cabinets that had probably been there for generations. According to my mother, strange things began happening after the tragedy. She sometimes thought she heard the faint sound of a baby crying somewhere inside the house. At first, she'd search every room, convinced she must be imagining it. But she could never find where the sound was coming from. Other times, she said she heard tiny footsteps moving through the hallway late at night. Occasionally, there were strange knocking or crackling noises coming from the old wooden wardrobe. Whether those sounds came from the old house settling or something else, none of us could say. The experience deeply unsettled her. The thing that frightened her most wasn't the noises. It was what she claimed to see. She occasionally described brief visions of a small child wrapped inside a clear plastic bag in the hallway before the image would disappear almost instantly. She never described these experiences dramatically. If anything, she seemed frightened by them herself. None of the rest of us ever saw what she claimed to see. That's what made it even stranger. Whatever she was experiencing seemed to affect only her. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was guilt because she'd tried so hard to help Mary and couldn't save either of them. Or maybe it was something none of us can explain. To this day, I honestly don't know. Only my mother ever reported those experiences. The rest of us heard the stories secondhand. A few months later, our family moved away from the compound. Life slowly continued. The property eventually became just another place from my childhood. But whenever I think back on those years, that night always comes back first. It's a story filled with tragedy, unanswered questions, and memories that have never completely faded. More than anything, I think about Mary. I think about how different things might have been if she'd felt safe enough to ask for help before everything reached that point. And I think about the lasting impact that one terrible night had on everyone who lived in that old house. Whether my mother's experiences afterward were the result of grief, trauma, or something far more mysterious, I'll probably never know. I only know that some memories never truly leave you. No matter how many years pass, certain nights remain with you forever. I've had a few experiences over the years that still bother me whenever I think about them. Neither one has a satisfying explanation. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary reason behind both of them. Maybe not. Either way, they've stayed with me for years because of how unsettling they were. The first happened when I was in my mid-20s. My wife and I had just moved from Europe back to the United States, where I grew up. The move happened incredibly fast. One week we were still overseas, planning everything, and the next we were unpacking our lives in a completely different country. There were countless things to organize: finding a place to live, setting up utilities, opening bank accounts, buying furniture, getting transportation sorted out. Everything felt rushed. One of the first things we did after arriving was buy new cell phones. Since we were coming from another country, neither of us could keep our old numbers. We both received completely new phone numbers that afternoon. At that point, nobody back in the United States knew how to contact me. Not my family, not my friends, not former coworkers. Nobody. The only person who knew my brand new number was my wife. She was standing right next to me when we bought the phones. After finishing that errand, we decided to celebrate finally being back. We found a nearby bar, had a couple of drinks, relaxed for a while, and then headed home. It had been a long day filled with travel, paperwork, and moving. By the time we got home, we were exhausted. We went straight to bed. The next morning, I picked up my phone to check the time. That's when I noticed something strange. I had several missed calls. At first, I assumed maybe my wife had accidentally called me while testing her phone. But the calls weren't from her. There was also a voicemail. Curious, I pressed play. What came through the speaker immediately made me uneasy. There wasn't any introduction, no explanation, no background conversation, just someone quietly repeating my name over and over again. The voice sounded weak, almost like a whisper. Not crying exactly, but somewhere between a whisper and a whimper. They simply kept saying my name, again and again and again, for nearly an entire minute. No message, no request to call back, nothing else, just my name, repeated dozens of times. Then the recording ended. I sat there staring at my phone. I replayed it several times, trying to recognize the voice. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. What disturbed me most wasn't the voicemail itself. It was the timing. How did anyone have my number? I'd only had it for a matter of hours. My wife was literally the only person who knew it. I've tried coming up with explanations over the years. Maybe the number had recently belonged to someone else. Maybe whoever left the message had intended to reach the previous owner. Maybe they were calling someone entirely different who happened to share my name. All of those possibilities seem reasonable. Still, hearing someone softly repeat your name for nearly a minute on the first night you've ever owned a phone is an incredibly unsettling experience. I've never forgotten it. The second story happened a few years later in my first apartment. The apartment sat on the edge of town near a partially wooded area. It wasn't isolated exactly, but it definitely felt quieter than most neighborhoods. My unit was on the ground floor. The bedroom had 2 windows positioned on different walls, both facing outside. Most nights the area was peaceful. You'd hear crickets, maybe a passing car. Nothing unusual. One night, while lying in bed, I got the unmistakable feeling that someone was outside. At first, I couldn't explain why. There wasn't a loud noise or anyone knocking. It was just one of those instincts that tells you something isn't right. So I stayed perfectly still and listened. A few moments later, I heard movement. Soft footsteps. Very close to the bedroom. Someone was definitely outside. I quietly got out of bed and moved toward one of the windows. As soon as I lifted the blinds to look out, whoever was outside stepped out of view. I couldn't see anyone. I waited. After a minute or so, I heard movement again. This time it came from the direction of the second window. I walked over and carefully peeked through those blinds instead. Again, nothing. The person had moved before I could see them. At that point, I realized something unsettling. Whoever was outside knew I was aware of them. They weren't trying to stay completely hidden anymore. Instead, they seemed to be deliberately staying just out of sight. They'd move to whichever window I wasn't standing near. If I walked across the room, they'd quietly shift positions outside. It became almost like a bizarre game, only I definitely wasn't enjoying it. This went on for several minutes. Every time I tried looking outside, they disappeared just before I caught sight of them. They never knocked, never spoke, never left. They simply kept moving around the outside of my bedroom. Eventually, my fear turned into anger. I got tired of feeling trapped inside my own apartment. So, I grabbed the nearest thing I could use to defend myself. A baseball bat. Without giving myself much time to reconsider, I unlocked the front door, threw it open, and charged outside yelling at the top of my lungs. I shouted something along the lines of, "You're messing with the wrong guy." The reaction was immediate. A person took off running. I only caught a glimpse of them before they disappeared into the darkness. Whoever they were, they clearly hadn't expected someone to come charging outside with a baseball bat. I never found out who it was. The police were never involved because by the time I got outside, the person had already vanished. Afterward, I spoke with a few neighbors. That's when I learned something interesting. The tenant who had lived in my apartment before me had been a young woman. From what I understood, she was considered very attractive. I've often wondered whether the person outside wasn't looking for me at all. Maybe they believed she still lived there. Maybe it was someone who had been watching her for some time and hadn't realized she'd moved away. If that's true, they probably expected to find a woman alone inside the apartment. Instead, they found a 6-foot-tall man charging into the yard with a baseball bat. If they were a peeping Tom or a stalker, I imagine that wasn't the ending they had planned. Thankfully, I never saw that person again. Nothing else happened after that night. Still, every now and then I think back to both of these experiences, the mysterious voicemail waiting on a phone number that almost nobody knew. The strangers silently circling my bedroom windows in the middle of the night. Neither event has ever been fully explained. Maybe both have perfectly ordinary answers. But even now, years later, they remain two of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. One of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard came from a friend of a friend. I've never been able to verify every detail myself, so I can't say with certainty exactly how much of it is true. Still, the story has stayed with me for years because, true or not, it's terrifying to imagine. According to what I was told, a young woman was out one evening with friends when she met a man at a bar. He seemed perfectly normal, friendly, polite, the kind of person nobody would think twice about talking to. They spent part of the evening chatting, getting to know each other, and eventually he invited her back to his apartment for another drink. She agreed. From everything I'd heard, there was nothing about him that raised any immediate red flags. It sounded like an ordinary night. They arrived at his place, continued talking, and had a drink together. For a while, everything seemed completely normal. Then she suddenly began feeling strange. At first she thought maybe she'd had too much to drink or wasn't feeling well. But the feeling came on quickly. She became dizzy, weak. Something didn't feel right. Instead of saying anything to the man, she excused herself and told him she needed to use the bathroom. The moment she closed the bathroom door behind her, she pulled out her phone. Somehow, despite feeling herself fading fast, she managed to call the emergency number. In my country, that's 112. She quietly gave the dispatcher the address. From what I was told, she tried to explain that something was wrong. Before she could finish speaking, however, she lost consciousness. The line suddenly went silent. Fortunately, the dispatcher realized this wasn't an ordinary disconnected call. Something about the conversation immediately raised alarm bells. Instead of assuming it was an accidental call, emergency services were sent to the address right away. Police officers responded, and if I remember correctly, firefighters also assisted because they expected they might need to force entry. When they arrived, no one answered the door. With very little time to waste, they forced their way inside. This is the part of the story that confused the woman the most afterward. She later remembered waking up while being carried outside. She couldn't see anything. Someone had placed a bag over her head. She recalled feeling frightened and completely disoriented. She couldn't understand why the very people rescuing her would cover her face instead of helping her see what was happening. At the time, nobody offered an explanation. The officers simply got her safely outside and into medical care. Physically, she survived. Emotionally, the experience stayed with her. Over the following weeks, she began seeing a psychologist to help process everything that had happened. Even though she'd escaped, she couldn't stop thinking about one detail: the bag over her head. Why had the police done that? What were they trying to keep her from seeing? Whenever she asked, she was reportedly told very little. The authorities avoided giving a direct answer. Eventually, according to the story, her psychologist insisted that withholding the information was preventing her recovery. If she was going to move forward, she needed to understand exactly what had happened after she lost consciousness. Only then was the full explanation supposedly given. When officers forced open the apartment door, they were met with a scene unlike anything they had expected. The entire interior had reportedly been covered in plastic sheeting. Walls, furniture, large sections of the room. Everything appeared to have been carefully prepared. In the center of the living room was a table. Attached to it were restraints designed to hold someone in place. Nearby was what officers described as a collection of knives and other items apparently intended to inflict pain. From the way the apartment had allegedly been arranged, investigators concluded that the woman had been drugged and that something far more horrifying had likely been planned. According to what I was heard, the police believed she had come dangerously close to becoming the victim of prolonged torture. The expected outcome likely would not have been survival. The officers had covered her head before carrying her outside because they didn't want her to wake up and see the apartment. They believed the scene would cause even greater psychological trauma if she witnessed it herself. Whether that decision was right or wrong, it was apparently made in an attempt to protect her from memories she would never be able to erase. Ironically, not knowing what had been hidden from her became its own source of trauma. She spent weeks wondering what had been so terrible that trained police officers believed she shouldn't even glimpse it. Learning the truth was horrifying, but at least it answered the question that had haunted her. One part of the story has always disturbed me almost as much as the apartment itself. From what I was told, the man received very little punishment. Because investigators couldn't prove exactly what he intended to do beyond a reasonable doubt, the most significant conviction reportedly related to drugging her. The far more frightening possibilities remained just that, possibilities. Intent can be incredibly difficult to prove in court without additional evidence. As a result, she eventually found herself living in the same city as him again. Just imagine how unsettling that must have been. Knowing someone you believed intended to harm you was still out there. Knowing you could run into him at the grocery store, on public transportation, or walking down the street. Whether that fear ever became reality, I don't know. What makes the story even stranger is that not long afterward, I heard another account from a neighboring country, only a few hours away, that sounded remarkably similar. Different people, different location, but many of the details felt almost identical. A woman, a man she had recently met, a drink, a sudden loss of consciousness, an apartment prepared in disturbing ways. I have no idea whether the two stories were connected. They may have had absolutely nothing to do with one another. They may simply have shared unsettling similarities. I've never found enough reliable information to say either way. Even so, the possibility has always lingered in the back of my mind. Whether every detail of the story is completely accurate or not, one thing has always stayed with me. Sometimes your instincts are the only warning you get. The woman felt something was wrong. Instead of dismissing that feeling, she acted. She locked herself in the bathroom. She made the emergency call. Even though she lost consciousness before she could explain everything, that single decision may have saved her life. That's the part of the story I think about most. Not the apartment, not the investigation, but the fact that, in what may have been the last few conscious moments she had, she trusted her instincts enough to ask for help. Had she waited even a few more minutes, the outcome might have been very different. One of the creepiest stories I've ever heard didn't happen directly to me, but to one of my closest friends. Even after all these years, it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, my friend worked as a bartender at one of the best-known gay dance clubs in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the kind of person everyone liked, very friendly, outgoing, and genuinely easy to talk to. He was also incredibly good-looking, so it wasn't unusual for people to flirt with him while he was working behind the bar. The club was always packed on weekends. The music was fantastic, the dance floor stayed busy until closing time, and the bartenders kept the drinks flowing all night. My friends and I weren't regulars, but we showed up often enough. Drink specials were hard to pass up, the music was great, and having a friend behind the bar usually meant stronger drinks for less money. It became one of our favorite places to spend an evening. Like most bars, it attracted all kinds of people. Some came to dance, some came to meet someone. Others simply wanted to relax after work. Faces changed every night, and after a while, everyone blended together. You'd have conversations with complete strangers, laugh together for an hour, and never see each other again. That's just how those places worked. About a month before everything happened, my friend told us about someone he'd met while working. He couldn't stop talking about him. He said there was this really attractive blonde guy who had been hanging around the bar. According to my friend, the guy was handsome, polite, well-dressed, and seemed a little shy. Nothing about him stood out as strange. If anything, he came across as quiet and almost nervous. My friend admitted he was interested. He'd spent part of the evening talking to him and was hoping they might end up going out sometime. From what he told us later, the guy seemed interested too. They'd been chatting for a while when my group happened to arrive. As usual, we walked over to the bar to say hello. The moment we interrupted their conversation, the blonde man suddenly became uncomfortable. He made an excuse, walked away, and disappeared into the crowd. My friend was disappointed. He joked that we'd ruined his chances with someone he thought was really cute. We laughed about it. It didn't seem like an important moment, just another missed connection at a busy nightclub. Life went on. About a month later, a few of us were hanging out together at our apartment one evening. We were playing cards around the kitchen table. Someone had the television on in the background, mostly as noise while we talked and played. None of us were really paying much attention. Then the breaking news interrupted whatever program had been on. Reports began coming in about a man who had just been arrested in Milwaukee. As the news coverage continued, they showed his photograph on the screen. The room immediately went quiet. I looked over at my friend. He had completely frozen. The cards were still in his hand. His face had gone pale. His eyes were locked on the television. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Then, he quietly looked at all of us and said something I'll never forget. "You guys remember that cute blonde guy I was trying to pick up last month?" We all nodded. "The one who left when you showed up?" He kept staring at the television. "That's him." None of us knew what to say. We looked back at the screen. The man in the photograph was the same person my friend had been describing only weeks earlier. It was Jeffrey Dahmer. The realization hit everyone at the table at the same time. Only a few weeks earlier, my friend had been standing face to face with one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. They talked, flirted, gotten to know each other, at least briefly. If we'd arrived a little later, if their conversation had continued, if my friend had decided to leave with him, it's impossible not to wonder how differently that night could have ended. Of course, there's no way to know what would have happened. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe Dahmer would have simply gone home alone. Or maybe my friend unknowingly came frighteningly close to becoming one of his victims. That's the part that's always stayed with me. When people imagine dangerous individuals, they often picture someone who immediately looks threatening. Someone who seems obviously evil. Real life usually isn't like that. By nearly every account, Dahmer appeared quiet, polite, and completely ordinary during casual interactions. That's part of what made him so dangerous. He didn't look like the monster everyone later came to know through the news. He looked like an average guy sitting at a bar. Looking back, my friend has said the same thing many times. Nothing about that conversation made him feel unsafe. There were no warning signs, no strange comments, nothing that made him think he should walk away. He simply thought he'd met an attractive, somewhat shy man at a nightclub. It wasn't until that photograph appeared on the evening news that he realized who he'd actually been talking to. Even now, decades later, that moment still gives me chills. Not because of anything supernatural, not because of some unbelievable coincidence, but because it reminds me how ordinary, extraordinary evil can appear. Sometimes the people who frighten us the most don't stand out in a crowd. Sometimes they smile, make small talk, buy a drink, blend in so completely that nobody notices them until it's far too late. Every time I think about that night, I picture my friend staring silently at the television with the card still in his hands, realizing that someone he'd hoped to go home with was actually one of history's most infamous serial killers. That's a realization I can't even begin to imagine. I'm fully aware that not everyone believes in ghosts. Honestly, I don't expect everyone to believe this story either. All I know is what my family experienced together, and none of us has ever been able to explain it. Even now, years later, every single one of us remembers those nights exactly the same way. My two brothers, my mom, and my stepdad all lived through it with me. We still talk about it from time to time, and every one of us remembers hearing the same thing. When I was somewhere between 6 and 8 years old, we lived in a huge, very old 2-story house. The place already felt unsettling from the day we moved in. It was one of those old homes with creaky floors, long hallways, and rooms that always seemed darker than they should have been. Because the house was so large, my stepdad let a few of his friends live there as roommates. Even with several adults and kids under one roof, the house somehow still felt empty. My bedroom was at the top of the staircase on the left side. For some reason, it didn't even have a door. Across the hallway were my brother's room and a few of the other bedrooms. The staircase itself was enclosed with a door at both the top and the bottom. Every single night before bed, I'd make sure both doors were closed. I was an anxious little kid, and closing those doors somehow made me feel safer. I couldn't explain why. It just did. At the time, I had absolutely no idea that anything significant had happened in that house. As far as I knew, it was simply an old place that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't until years later that my family finally told me the truth. The previous owner had been our great-uncle Earl. He had died in that house. More specifically, he had taken his own life in the very room where I slept every single night. According to my family, he had hanged himself from the ceiling directly above the spot where my bed sat. They had never told me because I was too young. Looking back, learning that detail explained why the house had always felt so unsettling to me, even before I knew its history. But none of us knew how strange our nights were about to become. Almost every evening, sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock, it would begin. The entire house would grow quiet. Then we'd hear it. Footsteps, not faint creaks, not the normal sounds an old house makes as it settles. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They always started downstairs. There was one detail that made it even stranger. The door at the bottom of the staircase never opened. You could clearly hear footsteps beginning at the bottom of the stairs, yet the door remained shut. No handle turning, no hinges squeaking. Nothing, just footsteps. Slow, steady, one step after another. They would climb the staircase exactly as though someone was walking toward us. Every single person in the house heard them. My brothers heard them. My mom heard them. My stepdad heard them. Even the roommates admitted they could hear them. The footsteps would reach the top of the stairs. Then they'd continue directly into my bedroom. Remember, my room didn't have a door, so whatever we were hearing sounded like it walked straight inside. Then, silence, only for a moment. A few seconds later, the footsteps would begin again, back at the bottom of the staircase. They'd slowly climb all the way to the top again. Walk into my room, disappear, then start over, again and again and again. This didn't happen once, it happened almost every single night. The pattern never really changed. The footsteps usually started around 10 or 11 at night and continued until around 4 in the morning. Every night. For years. As a little kid, I can't even describe how terrified I was. Even now, just thinking about it gives me chill. I can still remember lying perfectly still in bed, listening as those footsteps slowly climbed toward my room over and over again. Every time they reached the top of the stairs, I'd pull the blankets tighter around my head. I knew exactly where they were going. Straight into my bedroom. I don't think I slept properly for years while we lived there. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted proof that it was just someone in the house. Maybe one of the roommates couldn't sleep. Maybe someone was walking around for some perfectly normal reason. So I decided I was going to catch them. I waited until I heard the footsteps getting close. They climbed the stairs exactly like always, one step after another. As soon as they reached the top, I quickly opened the stairwell door and switched on the light. The footsteps stopped instantly. I looked down the staircase. There wasn't anyone there. No roommate, no family member, nothing. The staircase was completely empty. Not a single person stood between me and the bottom of the stairs. I remember freezing for a second before panic completely took over. I slammed the door shut, ran back into my room, jumped into bed, and hid under the blankets. A few moments later, the footsteps started again. Back at the bottom. Slowly climbing toward me. I don't think I've ever run that fast before or since. As frightening as it was for me, my youngest brother experienced something even stranger. He used to tell everyone that he saw people walking around inside the house at night. At the time, we weren't sure what to believe. Kids imagine things all the time. But after hearing those footsteps night after night, it became harder to dismiss what he was saying. He seemed completely convinced there were people in the house that no one else could see. Whether he was imagining it or experiencing something we couldn't, I'll never know. One of the strangest parts of the whole experience involved my mom. After months of listening to the footsteps every single night, she'd eventually had enough. Whenever they became especially loud, she'd yell from her bedroom, "Go to bed, Earl." She always used his name, and somehow the footsteps would stop. Not forever, but for the rest of that night. Every time she yelled, the house would suddenly become quiet. I know how unbelievable that sounds. If someone else told me the story, I'd probably have trouble believing it too. But every person living in that house remembers it happening. None of us has ever come up with a reasonable explanation. Years later, the old house was demolished. It wasn't abandoned or destroyed in a fire by accident. It was intentionally burned down in a controlled demolition to clear the land for a new housing development. Before everything disappeared forever, I went back to the property one last time. The house was gone. Only rubble remained. I picked up a couple of scorched bricks from the ruins and brought them home with me. Some people probably think that's a strange souvenir. Maybe it is. But that house shaped my childhood in ways I'll never forget. Those bricks remind me that the place was real. The memories were real. The fear was real. Whether what we experienced had a supernatural explanation or not, I honestly don't know. Maybe there was some logical answer we never discovered. Maybe there wasn't. All I know is that 5 different people heard the same footsteps for years. 5 people remember the exact same strange routine happening night after night. Whatever was causing those sounds has never been explained. Living in that house changed the way I think about the world. Before then, ghosts were just stories people told. Afterward, I couldn't dismiss the possibility so easily. To this day, I still don't know what we heard climbing those stairs every night. I only know that every member of my family remembers it. And after living through those years, I'll probably always believe there's more to this world than we can easily explain. To this day, I still think about Miss Pamela. When I was growing up in Pontiac, Michigan, she lived just a few houses away from us. As a kid, there were certain adults in the neighborhood who stood out, and she was definitely one of them. She wasn't the type of person who talked down to children or treated us like we were a nuisance. She spoke to me like I was an actual person. That might not sound like much, but when you're a kid, you remember the adults who make you feel seen. She was funny, easygoing, and always seemed to have a smile on her face whenever we crossed paths. I also remember she drove a really nice car. As a kid, I thought it was one of the coolest cars I'd ever seen. Whenever she'd pull into the neighborhood, I'd always notice it. Little things like that stick with you. To me, she wasn't just another adult. She was one of the cool neighbors. I had no idea that, like many adults, she was dealing with personal struggles that children simply don't notice. I didn't know she had problems with alcohol. I was too young to understand that people can carry burdens you never see. As far as I was concerned, she was just Miss Pamela. Then one day, she disappeared. At first, I didn't really understand what was happening. I just noticed people talking. Neighbors seemed worried. Family members came around more often. There was a tension in the neighborhood that hadn't been there before. As a child, you notice those things even if you don't fully understand them. The adults weren't saying much around us. I only learned the details years later. When Pamela was reported missing, her daughter immediately told the police something was wrong. She knew her mother. She insisted that this wasn't normal behavior. She believed something terrible had happened. But, from what I later learned, her concerns weren't taken as seriously as they should have been. Because Pamela struggled with alcohol, investigators reportedly assumed she had simply wandered off or disappeared on another drinking binge. Instead of treating her disappearance as suspicious from the beginning, they largely dismissed it. Looking back, that's one of the parts that bothers me the most. People can struggle with addiction and still deserve to be taken seriously when they go missing. Having personal problems shouldn't make someone easier to overlook. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. The truth turned out to be far more horrifying than anyone imagined. Someone wanted her car. Rather than simply stealing it while she wasn't around, he kidnapped her. He forced her into the trunk of her own vehicle and drove away. For days, she remained trapped inside that trunk. The thought alone is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being locked inside a dark, cramped space with no idea where you're being taken or whether anyone is looking for you. According to what later came out during the investigation, the man wasn't the only person who knew she was there. His girlfriend reportedly knew there was a woman locked inside the trunk. I've often wondered whether other people knew as well. Whether anyone else had the chance to do something. Whether someone could have made one anonymous phone call that might have saved her life. Those are questions that still haunt me. Eventually, Pamela was found. By then, it was too late. While trapped inside the trunk, she had consumed antifreeze. Whether it was from desperation, confusion, or because she believed it was her only chance to survive without water, I honestly don't know. Sadly, the poisoning proved fatal. She died because of everything that had happened to her. It's an unbelievably cruel way for anyone's life to end. When I learned the full story as an adult, it completely changed the way I remembered those childhood years. The woman I remembered as the friendly neighbor with the cool car had spent her final days enduring something no one should ever experience. It's heartbreaking to think about. The more I've thought about it over the years, the more I find myself thinking about her family, especially her daughter. Imagine knowing from the very beginning that something wasn't right. Imagine trying to convince people to take your concerns seriously, only to feel like no one was listening. Then imagine discovering that your worst fears were true all along. That's a burden no family should ever have to carry. I also think about her grandchildren. One thing everyone seemed to agree on was how much Pamela loved them. Whatever struggles she had in her own life, the people who knew her always talked about how devoted she was to those grandbabies. I truly hope they grew up knowing that. I hope they remember the loving parts of who she was, instead of only the tragedy that took her away. As a child, I couldn't understand any of this. I simply knew that one of the nice adults in the neighborhood was suddenly gone. Now that I'm around the same age she was back then, the story feels even more heartbreaking. When you're young, adults seem old. Now I realize she wasn't old at all. She was simply another person trying to live her life. Someone with flaws, like everyone else. Someone who deserved far better than what happened to her. Her story has stayed with me for decades. Not because it was some famous criminal case. Not because it made national headlines. But because she was real. She was someone I knew. Someone who smiled at neighborhood kids. Someone who treated me with kindness when she didn't have to. Every once in a while, I'll find myself thinking about her again. I'll remember that car. I'll remember how friendly she always was. Then I'll remember how badly she was failed. Failed by the man who kidnapped her. Failed by the people who knew she was trapped and did nothing. and, from everything I've learned since, failed by a system that didn't immediately recognize that a vulnerable woman had become the victim of a terrible crime. To me, she'll always be Miss Pamela. The kind neighbor who made a kid feel welcome. The woman with the cool car. Someone who deserved to grow old, surrounded by the family she loved. Instead, her life ended in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. Even after all these years, I still think about her. And I probably always will. I've experienced a few creepy moments over the years, but one story has stayed with me more than almost anything else. Compared to some of the truly horrifying experiences people share, it isn't especially violent or mysterious. No one was seriously hurt. There wasn't some shocking twist at the end. But for some reason, it has always bothered me. Maybe because it's the kind of thing that could happen to almost anyone. It happened to my sister's boyfriend's family many years ago. His younger brother still lived at home, and his parents had converted the attic into a bedroom for him. It was actually a pretty nice setup. He had his own space away from the rest of the house, along with his computer, television, and everything else a teenager could want. One day he was home alone while the rest of the family was out. He went upstairs to his room like he normally did. He sat down at his computer, put on his headphones, and started playing games or listening to music. As far as he knew, it was just another ordinary afternoon. He had absolutely no reason to think anything unusual was happening. While he was sitting upstairs, completely absorbed in whatever he was doing, someone broke into the house. Not just one person, from what I remember. There were multiple burglars. They weren't quiet, either. They moved through the house, searching every room. They opened drawers, pulled things off shelves, went through closets, tossed furniture around. By the time they were finished, the place had been completely ransacked. All of this happened while the youngest son was sitting directly above them. He was only 1 floor away. The entire time, he had no idea there were strangers walking through his home. He couldn't hear doors opening. He couldn't hear drawers being emptied. He couldn't hear furniture being moved. The headphones blocked everything out. He was completely unaware that his house was being robbed beneath him. The burglars, somehow, never realized anyone was upstairs. Or maybe they did and simply chose not to go up there. No one has ever really known. That's one of the things that has always made the story so unsettling to me. If they had walked upstairs, if they had opened that bedroom door, who knows what might have happened. Eventually, the burglars left. The young man remained upstairs the entire time, completely oblivious. Sometime later, his parents came home. Instead of walking into the normal, peaceful house they'd left that morning, they found complete chaos. Drawers had been emptied onto the floor. Cabinets were standing open. Furniture had been moved. Valuable items were missing. The house had been torn apart. Then an even more terrifying thought hit them. Their youngest son was supposed to be home alone. Imagine realizing your home has just been robbed, while also remembering your child should still be inside. For those first few seconds, they had no way of knowing whether he was hiding, injured, or even alive. I can't imagine the fear they must have felt. They immediately started shouting his name, over and over again. They yelled as loudly as they could while running through the house. At first, there was no answer. He still had his headphones on. Finally, after hearing all the commotion, he took them off and came downstairs. Completely confused, he couldn't understand why everyone was screaming, or why the house looked like a disaster. That's when he learned what had happened. He had been sitting only a short distance away while complete strangers robbed the entire house around him. The relief his parents must have felt when they saw him standing there unharmed is almost impossible to imagine. I'm sure, for a brief moment, they were preparing themselves for the worst. Instead, they found him perfectly safe. Shaken once he understood what had happened, but physically unharmed. That story has stayed with me ever since. Not because of the robbery itself. Unfortunately, burglaries happen every day. What unsettles me is how close danger came without anyone realizing it. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't trying to stay quiet. He wasn't frozen in fear. He simply had no idea anyone else was in the house. Sometimes I think that's almost scarier than knowing. The burglars could have walked into his room at any moment. He would have been completely caught off guard. He wouldn't have had time to react. He wouldn't even have known they were there until they were standing right in front of him. Ever since hearing that story, I've never felt completely comfortable being home alone. Even though decades have passed, it still pops into my mind on quiet nights. Sometimes, if I can't sleep and every little sound in the house seems louder than usual, I think about that family. I think about how ordinary that afternoon started, how one person sat upstairs believing everything was perfectly normal, while strangers moved through the rooms below. It reminds me how quickly a peaceful day can change. Even now, more than 30 years later, I'll occasionally find myself checking that the doors are locked one more time before going to bed. I'll pause after hearing a strange noise and listen a little longer than most people probably would. Maybe it's irrational. Maybe it's just one of those stories that leaves a permanent mark on your imagination. I've often joked that I should get a dog, not because I expect anything to happen, but because I think hearing a dog bark would probably help me sleep a little easier. To this day, that's still one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. Not because something terrible happened, but because something terrible almost did, and the only thing separating an ordinary afternoon from a tragedy may have been the simple fact that the burglars never decided to walk upstairs. One of the most terrifying experiences of my life is something I don't actually remember happening. Everything I know about it was told to me by other people. Years ago, I used to suffer from severe sleep terrors. These weren't ordinary nightmares where you wake up frightened but can still remember parts of the dream. During a sleep terror, I would appear to be fully awake even though I was still asleep. I'd walk around, scream, and sometimes even interact with people. Yet when it was over, I had absolutely no memory of any of it. It was like my body was awake, while my mind was somewhere else entirely. My family used to tell me that my episodes were frightening to witness. They said there were nights when I screamed so loudly that the neighbors woke up. At first, I didn't really believe them. I assumed they were exaggerating. After all, how loud could someone possibly scream while they were asleep? But over time, several different people described the exact same thing. None of them knew how the others had explained it, yet their stories matched almost perfectly. They all said it wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't the kind of sound someone makes after a bad dream. They described it as something primal. A long, piercing scream that didn't sound like it belonged to someone who was awake or even fully human. Every person who witnessed it said it was one of the most disturbing sounds they'd ever heard. Still, because I never remembered any of these episodes, they always felt distant, almost fictional. It was as if people were telling me stories about someone else. I knew they were talking about me, but without any memory of it, it was difficult to truly understand what they had experienced. Then came the night that changed everything. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend. It had been a completely normal evening. We had dinner, watched television, talked for a while, and eventually went to bed. There wasn't anything unusual about that day. Nothing stressful had happened. Nothing that would have made either of us think the night would be any different from the hundreds before it. The next thing I remember is waking up in complete confusion. I wasn't lying comfortably in bed. Instead, I was on the floor. My boyfriend was holding on to me as tightly as he could while shouting my name over and over again. His face was pale. He was breathing hard. The look in his eyes wasn't frustration or annoyance. It was pure fear. For several seconds, I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. The balcony doors were wide open. Cold air was pouring into the apartment. I realized one of my legs was already outside the railing, while the rest of my body was inside where my boyfriend had pulled me back. If he'd reached me only moments later, I honestly don't know what would have happened. Once we both managed to calm down enough to speak, he suddenly started crying. I'd never seen him like that before. He wasn't someone who cried easily. He kept saying he thought he was about to watch me die. Eventually, after collecting himself, he explained what had happened from his point of view. He said he had been sleeping peacefully when something suddenly woke him. At first, he couldn't figure out what had disturbed him. Then, he looked toward my side of the room. I was standing beside the bed, perfectly still. My eyes were open, but according to him, there was absolutely no expression on my face. He said it looked like my body was awake while my mind was completely absent. He called my name. I didn't react. Not even a slight movement. I just stood there, staring into nothing. Then he noticed my breathing. I had started panting. Slowly at first, then faster. The sound became louder and more desperate, as though I had just finished running for miles. He was still trying to understand what was happening when I suddenly let out a scream. He told me later that he had never heard anything remotely like it. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It wasn't someone yelling for help. It wasn't even the kind of scream you'd hear in a horror movie. He said it sounded completely unnatural. A long, piercing cry that instantly made every hair on his body stand up. Even years later, he admitted he still couldn't describe it properly. He only knew he never wanted to hear anything like it again. Before he could even react, I suddenly sprinted toward the balcony. I wasn't stumbling. I wasn't confused. I moved with complete purpose. Still screaming, I unlocked the balcony door, slid it open, stepped outside, and immediately started climbing over the railing. All of it happened in just a few seconds. He barely had time to process what he was seeing. He jumped out of bed and ran after me. According to him, he reached me just as one of my legs cleared the railing. He grabbed me around the waist with everything he had and pulled me backward. The force of it sent both of us crashing onto the floor inside the apartment. That was the exact moment I woke up. To me, it felt as though I had simply opened my eyes. 1 second I was asleep. The next, I was lying on the floor with my boyfriend holding on to me while yelling my name. I had absolutely no memory of standing up. No memory of screaming. No memory of unlocking the balcony door. No memory of walking outside. No memory of trying to climb over the railing. Those minutes simply didn't exist in my mind. Listening to him describe everything afterward was one of the strangest experiences of my life. It honestly felt like he was describing another person. I couldn't imagine myself behaving that way. It sounded impossible. Yet every piece of evidence was sitting right in front of me. The open balcony doors, the position we were both in, the terror on his face. None of it could be explained away. It had happened. I just couldn't remember it. For him, that night became one of the most frightening experiences he'd ever lived through. For me, it created an entirely different fear. I realized I couldn't fully trust myself while I was asleep. That thought stayed with me for years. After we eventually went our separate ways, I found the idea of living alone incredibly difficult. Most people worry about burglars, fires, or strangers breaking into their homes. I worried about what I might do without even knowing it. Every apartment with a balcony made me nervous. Every open window caught my attention. Every staircase became something I looked at differently. I couldn't stop imagining myself having another sleep terror with no one nearby to stop me. It took years before I finally felt comfortable living by myself. Even now, I still think about that night sometimes. Not because I remember it. I don't. What stays with me is the story someone else told me. It's strange how one of the biggest moments of my life exists entirely through another person's memory instead of my own. Most frightening experiences leave behind vivid memories that replay in your mind. I don't have that. I only have the image my boyfriend painted for me. Standing silently beside the bed, panting, screaming, running toward the balcony, trying to climb over the railing without ever waking up. In some ways, I think that's even more disturbing. Because if it happened once without me knowing, part of me will always wonder whether it could happen again. To this day, my biggest fear isn't having another nightmare. It's waking up halfway through another sleep terror and realizing I'm already in the middle of doing something I have absolutely no control over. That possibility has stayed with me ever since, and I can honestly say it's one of the most unsettling thoughts I've ever had.